Okay, now we're going to be talking about the bandsaw. This is one of the machines that we use after we've gone through some of the preliminary milling procedures. We've already put our board through the planer and edge jointed it and cross cut it on the chop saw and maybe ripped it on the table saw. So now we've got a nice clean piece of stock that we're going to be working on. I'm going to talk a little bit about the bandsaw. This machine here is basically a saw blade, a continuous saw blade that runs over a wheel on top and under a wheel on the bottom. The bottom is a drive wheel and the top is just a free wheel. And this band saw, or saw that's a continuous band, runs all the way around. So as the wheels turn, the blade comes down from the top wheel, the teeth are pointing down, and it basically holds the work down against the table as it's cutting. Now you've got a guard on here that you can lower down to within 1/8 to 1/4 inch of the work that you're working on. So as an example, if I have a 3/4 inch piece of stock like this, and I get ready to make a cut on the bandsaw, I'm going to want to set the guide blocks or the guard of the saw just about 1/4 inch above the blade. That's so if I do happen to shove my hands through there, again, I'll only take a little nick rather than cutting a whole finger off. The other reason we'd want to lower the guard as low as possible is that this band is fairly flexible. And if you're trying to make a tight turn with the band, you can turn it so intensely that it'll pop off the wheels and then the saw will stop running. So lowering the guard that also contains a couple of guide blocks keeps that blade from twisting too much when you're making tight turns. Okay? Now one of the advantages of using a bandsaw is that you can make tight turns in material. You'll notice that we do have a table here, but we don't have a fence anywhere. So this is basically a freehand tool. You do have to keep your work down against the table. On the table saw and the chop saw and the joiner, you're always keeping your work down against the table and up against the fence. Those are the control surfaces and the references to make sure that you get a good cut. But since we're doing freehand or curved cuts on this tool, we don't have a fence in the way, so we can make the turns. One of the restrictions is that on a certain size of bandsaw, you only have a certain size throat between the blade and the throat of the saw here. So if this piece of material was any longer and I tried to get it around a corner here, I'd knock into the throat. So I do a lot of my work on the outside. Okay? But if I had to say, take a wavy cut down the middle of this board and it was this wide, I couldn't get it through this saw. We do have larger band saws up to 30-inch throat that we can get the material through. So I'll show you how I'd use this tool typically. What we've done is we've established a template or a shape that we want to cut out. And we've used 1/4 inch plywood to do this because the 1/4 inch plywood, for one thing, is cheaper than the stock that we might want to make our project out of, and it's easier to work. In other words, I cut this shape originally on the bandsaw and it was real easy to cut, and then I could shape it to final shape and a nice symmetrical shape with a piece of sandpaper, which is much harder to do on a 3/4 inch piece of stock. So once we've established our shape with a template, and sometimes you can draw your work right on your working stock, but because I want to reproduce this part more than once, then having a template is going to be an advantage for me because I can use the same shape over and over again and apply it to the stock. And you also see another use for this template a little bit later on another machine. Okay, so I'm going to place the template on my working stock, hold it down, make sure it's referenced to the sides, the bottom, and the other side, and then make myself a nice dark line around here. Okay. It doesn't hurt to make the pencil line real dark because you're going to cut most of it away anyway. So, in preparation to make the cut, just like most of the other power tools, I want to make sure the floor is clear. I'm not going to trip on anything. I've set my fence or my guard to the correct height, and in this case it's just about 1/4 inch above the working stock. I've got my safety glasses on. I make sure I don't have any loose clothing that can get caught in the saw as it goes through. So when I start the cut, I'm going to enter the cut with the line lined up with the blade, and then I'm going to work my way around. So we'll demonstrate that right now. I turn the tool on. I'm making a cut on the bandsaw. I tell people it's a lot like driving a car. I don't want to look directly at the blade and the line. I want to look at the line ahead of the blade. Because when you're driving a car, you're not looking out the window at the tires where they are on the road. You're looking at the road. So I'm watching the road where I want to go, and that wants to be about a 32nd of an inch outside the pencil line. So you can see on certain kinds of material, pine is fairly soft, so it cuts really easily. It cuts like butter, as a matter of fact, according to the type of the blade that you have on the saw. Now these table saw, or these bandsaw blades, they come in different widths and with a different number of teeth on the blade according to what you want to do. This particular blade happens to be a 1/4 inch blade with 5 teeth per inch. It's a pretty aggressively cutting blade. So just like it's aggressive in cutting through a piece of wood, it can be aggressive in cutting through flesh and bone. So you always want to watch out. I'm going to show you a couple of techniques for guiding small pieces through the saw so that you don't cut yourself. When we're cutting really small parts on the bandsaw, since we're in such close proximity to a blade that doesn't have a fence and doesn't necessarily have a guard on it in the area that we're cutting, then we're going to want to use a little push stick to help us through the cut. So say I wanted to make a cut on a piece of material like that, and I want to guide this through the saw, but I don't want to have my thumbs anywhere near the cut or the end of the cut when I'm done. So I just find myself a little piece of scrap that's not going to break when I'm using it as a push stick. Turn the saw on. So you've kept your fingers away from the blade when you're making those types of small cuts. This tool can be pretty dangerous because it seems so easy to use. I've probably seen more blood come off the table of a bandsaw than I have in any other tool in the shop. People have a tendency to become complacent when it's a tool that's easy to use. They're not really paying attention. Another thing that you want to watch out for is, say you've made your cut and your scrap is real close to the blade. You don't want to reach in there with your hand and grab that scrap. So what I'm doing is setting up a scenario that you might run into. If you had made a cut on the saw and your off-fall falls in there and it gets in the way, you can't make any further cuts. You never want to reach in there and grab that with your fingers. There's no way you can get in there with your fingers and not cut yourself. Again, you got your push stick, or you might have another piece of off-fall that's there. Just use that to get that piece of material out of there. Now if you can't get it out while the saw is running, turn the saw off. Let it wind all the way down before you get anywhere near that blade. Okay, so I've turned the saw off, the blade's stopped, and maybe I don't even want to get my fingers near that blade because I could still cut myself even if it's not running.